Professor Vex Thornbottom adjusted his 3 pairs of spectacles and gazed out at his classroom with the kind of smug satisfaction that only comes from knowing you're about to educate the ignorant masses. The Galactic University's Lecture Hall Omega-7 was packed to the brim with eager young minds from across the galaxy, all here to learn about the fascinating subject of extinct civilizations. Well, as fascinating as dead species could be, anyway. "Welcome, welcome, my dear students," Vex announced, his voice carrying that particular brand of academic arrogance that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else but was graciously blessing them with his presence. "Today, we begin our journey through the tragic tales of species that simply couldn't adapt to the harsh realities of galactic evolution." The professor was a Zephyrin, which meant he looked like someone had crossed a praying mantis with a very pretentious librarian. His green exoskeleton gleamed under the lecture hall lights, and his compound eyes swept across the diverse crowd of students. There were Blorbonians with their characteristic purple tentacles, a few crystalline echoes that looked like walking diamonds, and several other species that would make a xenobiologist weep with joy. "Now then," Vex continued, activating his holographic display with a flourish that was entirely unnecessary but very much in character. "Let us begin with one of the most pathetically primitive species ever documented. Behold, the humans of Earth." A 3-dimensional image of a human appeared in the center of the room, rotating slowly like a sad museum exhibit. The students leaned forward with mild interest, the way one might observe a particularly unremarkable rock formation. "He's bipedal creatures," Vex said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Managed to achieve basic spaceflight before promptly wiping themselves out through a combination of environmental destruction, nuclear warfare, and an inexplicable obsession with something called reality television. Truly a cautionary tale for the ages." A Blorbonian student raised one of her tentacles. "Professor, how long ago did they go extinct?" "Ah, excellent question, Miss Glorbinia," Vex replied, puffing up with pride at his own expertise. "The humans of Earth went extinct approximately 350 standard galactic years ago. A blink of an eye in cosmic terms, really. They barely had time to leave their mark on the universe before natural selection decided they were better off as a footnote in history." He gestured grandly at the hologram, which was now showing various scenes of Earth's supposed final days. "As you can see, they were woefully unprepared for the challenges of galactic civilization. No natural armor, no enhanced sensory organs, no ability to photosynthesize, just soft pink skin and an alarming tendency to make decisions based on something they called emotions. Frankly, it's surprising they lasted as long as they did." The students nodded knowingly, secure in their superiority over these long-dead primitives. After all, they were here, at the most prestigious university in the galaxy, learning from the most distinguished professors. They were clearly the pinnacle of evolution, unlike these sad, extinct humans. "Their greatest achievement," Vex continued with a theatrical sigh, "was apparently creating a global communication network that they used primarily to share pictures of small, furry creatures and argue about trivial matters. Imagine the waste of potential. With such technology, they could have achieved so much more if they'd possessed even a fraction of our intellectual capacity." The lecture hall filled with the alien equivalent of knowing chuckles. Everyone was having a delightful time feeling superior to a species that couldn't even manage to survive long enough to join the galactic community. It was, by all accounts, a perfectly normal day in Professor Thornbottom's perfectly normal class about perfectly dead civilization. At least, it was until someone in the back row raised their hand. The hand belonged to Jake Martinez, a student who had somehow managed to fly completely under Professor Thornbottom's radar for the entire semester, which was remarkable, really, considering Jake looked exactly like the holographic humans spinning in the center of the room. And by exactly, I mean if you put them side by side, you'd have to wonder if the universe had developed a sense of humor and decided to play the galaxy's most awkward practical joke. "Yes, Mr. Martinez?" Vex said, squinting at Jake through his multiple pairs of spectacles. "Do you have a question about these fascinating extinct primitives?" Jake cleared his throat, and when he spoke, his voice had that particular quality of someone who was about to ruin everyone's day with a single sentence. "Well, Professor, I was just wondering, if humans went extinct 350 years ago, then what planet am I from exactly?" The silence that followed was the kind of silence that archaeologists would later study as a perfect example of awkward crystallized into pure, uncomfortable energy. It was the silence of 27 alien minds simultaneously arriving at the same horrifying conclusion, while trying very hard not to think about it. Professor Thornbottom's compound eyes widened to approximately the size of dinner plates. His mandibles clicked nervously as he processed what Jake had just said. Then he processed it again. Then he tried very hard not to process it at all, but unfortunately, his brain was having none of that nonsense. "I beg your pardon," Vex managed to croak out, his voice climbing about 3 octaves higher than usual. "I said, what planet am I from?" Jake repeated helpfully, standing up so everyone could get a really good look at him. "Because, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but I'm pretty sure I tick all the boxes for being human. Bipedal, check. Soft pink skin, check. No natural armor, definitely check. And I have to say, I do have an inexplicable fondness for pictures of small, furry creatures." The Blorbonian student, Miss Glorbenia, raised a tentacle with the shaky enthusiasm of someone who desperately wanted to be anywhere else. "Professor, he does look remarkably similar to the holographic projection." "Remarkably similar," squeaked a crystalline echo from the front row. "He's identical, look at him. He's got the same number of limbs, the same facial structure, even the same confused expression that human in the hologram is wearing." Vex's exoskeleton began to make a high-pitched whining sound, which was the Zephyrian equivalent of a nervous breakdown trying to happen in real time. Now, students, let's not jump to conclusions. There are many possible explanations for this apparent similarity." "Like what?" Jake asked, and there was definitely a hint of amusement in his voice now. He was clearly enjoying this way more than any reasonable person should. "Well, Vex stammered, his academic confidence crumbling faster than a sandcastle in a tsunami. "Perhaps you're from a planet where convergent evolution resulted in a species that happens to look exactly like humans. Yes, that's it, convergent evolution. It's a well-documented phenomenon." The entire class turned to stare at their professor, with the kind of expression usually reserved for watching someone try to convince everyone that water isn't wet. "Or," Vex continued, his voice getting more desperate by the second, "perhaps you're wearing a very sophisticated disguise. A costume, yes, you're probably a very dedicated cosplayer. The attention to detail is remarkable." Jake looked down at himself, then back at the professor. "Sir, I'm not wearing a costume. This is just what I look like. I wake up like this every morning." "It's impossible," Vex declared, but his voice cracked like a teenager hitting puberty. "The records clearly state that humans went extinct. The Galactic Council's Department of Extinct Species filed all the paperwork. There was a memorial service. We sent flowers." "You sent flowers to a memorial service for my entire species?" Jake asked, raising an eyebrow. "That's either really thoughtful or really weird, and I'm not sure which." The whining sound from Vex's exoskeleton was getting louder, and several students in the front row were starting to look genuinely concerned for their professor's mental health. Professor Thornbottom was now in full damage control mode, which for a Zephyrian academic meant throwing around increasingly ridiculous theories while hoping one of them would stick. It was like watching someone try to fix a leaking dam with bubblegum and wishful thinking. "Perhaps," Vex announced with the desperate enthusiasm of a used spaceship salesman, "you're from a previously undiscovered species that evolved to look exactly like humans, as a form of evolutionary mimicry. Yes, you're a human mimic, like those butterflies that look like other butterflies but with more existential crisis." Jake tilted his head thoughtfully. "Okay, but here's the thing, Professor. I'm not just human-looking. I'm actually from Earth. You know, the planet you just said was completely destroyed?" The professor's eye twitched. Actually, all of his eyes twitched, which was quite a sight to behold. "Nonsense! Earth is gone. Kaput. Finito. We have satellite imagery of the debris field." "Really?" Jake asked, pulling out what looked suspiciously like a standard Earth smartphone. "Because I've got my mom on speed dial if you'd like to chat with her. She's probably making dinner right now. It's Tuesday, so probably meatloaf." The entire classroom leaned forward like they were watching the galaxy's most uncomfortable tennis match. Miss Glorbinia's tentacles were practically vibrating with excitement. Your mother?" Vex's voice had now reached frequencies that only dogs and very confused dolphins could hear properly. "Yeah, Linda Martinez. She lives in Ohio, works at the DMV, has very strong opinions about people who don't use their turn signals." Jake scrolled through his phone with the casual air of someone who wasn't currently causing a galactic incident. "She's also got this weird thing about keeping the thermostat at exactly 72 degrees. Drives my dad crazy." A crystalline echo in the third row began making a sound like wind chimes in a hurricane. "He's got specific details about his family, and domestic disputes over temperature control. That's remarkably authentic for a supposed extinct species." "And did anyone else notice," added a student who looked like a cross between a lobster and a philosophy major, "that he mentioned something called Ohio? I've studied the extinct human civilization extensively for my thesis, and Ohio was definitely a documented location on Earth, a rather unremarkable one, if I recall correctly. Hey now, Jake said, looking mildly offended. Ohio's not that bad. We've got Cedar Point, and decent corn. Professor Thornbottom was now pacing back and forth like a caged animal, if caged animals wore academic robes and had severe anxiety disorders. This is impossible. The records are clear. Earth suffered a complete ecological collapse, followed by nuclear annihilation. The atmosphere was poisoned, the oceans boiled, the very ground was salted with radioactive waste. Jake said, checking his phone again. According to the weather app, it's currently 74 degrees and partly cloudy in Columbus. Also, my buddy Derek just posted a picture of his lunch on social media. Looks like a pretty decent sandwich, actually. Social media? Squeaked another student. Didn't the professor just say they used their communication network to share pictures of small furry creatures? Oh yeah, Jake grinned. That's still totally a thing. Want to see a picture of my neighbor's cat? His name is Mr. Whiskers, and he's achieved minor internet fame for his ability to look perpetually disappointed. The whining from Vex's exoskeleton had now reached a pitch that was causing several students to cover their auditory organs. This is all some elaborate hoax, a practical joke. Someone is playing a very cruel prank on the academic community. Or, Jake said, with the kind of cheerful helpfulness that makes people want to hide under their desks, maybe your information about Earth's extinction is just completely wrong. I mean, it happens, even to prestigious professors at fancy galactic universities. The silence that followed was so complete that you could have heard a pin drop, assuming pins made any noise in the vacuum of space, which they don't, but the metaphor still works, because everyone was holding their breath anyway. Professor Thornbottom stared at Jake with the expression of someone who had just realized that their entire career was built on what appeared to be galactic fake news. Jake seemed to sense that this was his moment to really lean into the chaos. He stood up, fully, stretched like someone who'd been sitting through a particularly long and tedious lecture, and addressed the room with the casual confidence of someone who was about to turn the entire galactic understanding of reality upside down. So here's the thing, Jake began, and you could practically hear the collective intake of breath from 27 alien students who suddenly realized they were about to witness either the greatest academic scandal in galactic history or the most elaborate practical joke ever conceived. Earth isn't extinct. Like, not even a little bit. We've got about 8 billion humans running around doing human things. Building stuff, arguing about politics, trying to figure out why hot dogs come in packages of 10, but hot dog buns come in packages of 8. You know, the usual. Professor Thornbottom's compound eyes were now so wide they looked like they might pop right out of his head. 8 billion, he whispered. 8 billion humans. But that's more than the entire population of the Galactic Council. Yeah, we're kind of prolific, Jake admitted with a shrug. Also, just so you know, we've been watching you guys for about, 200 years or so. We figured out faster than light travel around the same time you supposedly filed our extinction paperwork. Which is hilarious, by the way. We've got a whole department back on Earth that does nothing but monitor galactic bureaucracy for laughs. The silence in the room was now so profound that it had achieved its own gravitational field. Miss Glorbinia's tentacles had gone completely limp with shock. The crystalline echo in the front row was flickering like a broken hologram. Even the lobster philosophy major had stopped making clicking sounds. "You've been watching us?" Vex managed to croak out, his voice barely above a whisper. "Oh, absolutely," Jake said, warming to his subject. "We've got surveillance satellites all over the galaxy. Really advanced stuff. We know about your secret cookie stash in your desk drawer, Professor. Zephyrian sugar cookies, if I'm not mistaken. The ones from that little bakery on Rigel 7 that you pretend you don't like but order every month." Professor Thornbottom's exoskeleton went from green to a pale, sickly yellow. "How could you possibly know about that?" "Because humans are really, really good at two things," Jake explained cheerfully. "Making technology that's way more advanced than anyone expects, and using that technology to find out embarrassing details about other people's lives. It's kind of our thing." A student in the middle row, who looked like a cross between a squid and a filing cabinet, raised what might have been a hand. "But if you're so technologically advanced, why haven't you made contact with the Galactic Council?" Jake's grin widened. "Because we've been listening to your communications for 2 centuries, and honestly, you guys are kind of jerks. No offense, Professor, but that whole lecture about us being pathetically primitive wasn't exactly making us excited to introduce ourselves." "We're not jerks," protested Miss Gorbenia, her tentacles waving indignantly. We're highly evolved beings, with sophisticated cultures and advanced ethical systems. Uh-huh, Jake said, pulling out his phone again. So explain to me why the Galactic Council's most recent resolution was to declare war on the Fuzzy Bunny planet because they refused to share their carrot cake recipe. The entire class turned to stare at Professor Thornbottom, who was now making a sound like a deflating balloon. How did you know about that? That was classified information. We hacked your databases on Tuesday, Jake said matter-of-factly. Took about 6 minutes. Your security system is basically the galactic equivalent of leaving your front door unlocked with a sign that says, "Please don't steal my stuff." Also, we've been selling you guys advanced technology for decades. Those quantum processors you're so proud of? We invented those in the 1990s. We just put them in shiny boxes and charged you triple. The revelation hit the room like a meteor strike. Students began looking around at each other with the dawning realization that they might not be the sophisticated, advanced beings they'd always thought they were. "The quantum processors are from the 1990s?" whispered the crystalline echo. "But those are considered the pinnacle of galactic technology." "Yeah, we've got much better stuff now," Jake said. "We're working on technology that would probably make your heads explode, literally in some cases. We had to dial back our first contact protocols because apparently your species aren't ready for concepts like Wi-Fi passwords and pop-up ads." Professor Thornbottom was now sitting in his chair, staring at the ceiling with the expression of someone whose entire worldview had just been fed through a blender. "This is impossible. Our intelligence networks would have detected a thriving human civilization. We have the best information-gathering systems in the galaxy." "Professor," Jake said gently, "your intelligence networks couldn't find their way out of a paper bag if the bag was labeled exit and had flashing neon arrows pointing toward the opening. We've been running circles around you for 2 centuries. And that's when Professor Thornbottom made the sound that would later be described by xenolinguists as the exact moment when supreme academic confidence collided with crushing existential horror and exploded into 1,000 pieces of wounded pride. The sound Professor Thornbottom made was apparently some kind of Zephyrian distress signal, because within approximately 30 seconds, the lecture hall doors burst open like someone had just yelled fire in a crowded theater. Except instead of people fleeing, what rushed in was the most impressively panicked collection of university officials that Jake had ever seen. First through the door was Dean Quibbleton, a Rigellian who looked like someone had crossed a walrus with a very anxious accountant. Behind him came Assistant Dean Flurble, whose species Jake couldn't identify but who appeared to be made entirely of nervous energy and sweating various colored liquids. Bringing up the rear was the Director of Crisis Management, a being that resembled a sentient filing cabinet with anger issues. "What's the situation?" Dean Quibbleton demanded, his tusks gleaming with what Jake was pretty sure was stress-induced saliva. "We received reports of an academic emergency of the highest magnitude." "Emergency?" Jake asked, looking around the room with genuine confusion. "I was just asking about my homework." Professor Thornbottom pointed a shaking appendage at Jake while making a sound like a broken air conditioning unit. "Dean, we have a situation. The student claims to be human, an actual, living human, from Earth, which is supposedly extinct." The dean's eyes widened to approximately the size of dinner plates. "That's impossible. We sent a fruit basket to their memorial service." "You sent a fruit basket?" Jake asked. "What kind of fruit?" "Rigellian, pomegranates, and some of those little cheese cubes," the dean replied automatically, then caught himself. "Wait, that's not the point. The point is, you can't be human, because humans are extinct." Jake held up his phone. "Would you like to video call my mom? She's probably wondering why I haven't called her this week anyway." The Director of Crisis Management, who had been quietly having what appeared to be a nervous breakdown in the corner, suddenly sprang into action. "Nobody call anybody. We need to contain this situation immediately. Code Red! Code Red! Deploy the memory erasure protocols." "Memory erasure protocols?" Jake raised an eyebrow. "That seems a bit extreme. I mean, it's not like I'm planning to invade anybody. I just want to pass my Extinct Civilizations class." "You can't pass a class about extinct civilizations if you're a member of one of the supposedly extinct civilizations," shrieked Assistant Dean Flurble, now sweating what appeared to be rainbow-colored panic juice. "It's a paradox. It breaks the entire academic system." "Actually," Jake said thoughtfully, "I think it just means your information is wrong, which happens, even to prestigious galactic universities." The room erupted into chaos as various officials began talking over each other in increasingly high-pitched voices. The dean was frantically making phone calls to what sounded like the Galactic Council's emergency hotline. The director of crisis management was trying to set up some kind of containment field around Jake, who was still sitting casually in his chair like he was watching a particularly entertaining movie. "This is impossible," the dean was shouting into his communicator. "We need an emergency session of the council. Yes, I know it's their lunch break. This is more important than their lunch break." "Sir," Jake interjected politely, "while you're calling the council, you might want to mention that Earth has been trying to reach them for about 50 years. We've sent approximately 14,000 formal diplomatic communications to their office. They all got returned to sender with a stamp that said, 'Species not found.'" The dean's communicator slipped from his grasp and clattered to the floor. 14,000 diplomatic communications? "Yeah, we've got a whole department for it," Jake explained. "The Department of Galactic Relations, really nice people. They throw a great office Christmas party. Well, they did until they realized nobody was reading their mail." Professor Thornbottom, who had been sitting in stunned silence, suddenly perked up. "Wait, if you've been trying to make contact for 50 years, and you've been monitoring our communications for 200 years, that means we know exactly how your government works," Jake finished cheerfully. "We've got detailed profiles on every council member, complete psychological workups, and we know about that thing with the Andromedan ambassador and the rubber duck incident." The silence that followed was so complete that it achieved its own weather system. Assistant Dean Flurble had stopped sweating and was now making a sound like a deflating balloon. The director of crisis management was holding his head in his hands and muttering something about early retirement. "The rubber duck incident is classified at the highest levels of galactic security," the dean whispered. "How could you possibly know about that?" "Because," Jake said with a grin that was probably visible from orbit, "humans are really, really good at finding out things that other people don't want them to know. It's like a hobby for us." "This is a disaster," moaned the director of crisis management. "A complete and total disaster. Do you have any idea what this means for galactic relations, for our understanding of the universe, for my quarterly performance review?" Jake checked his phone again. "Actually, if it helps, I just got a text from my roommate. Apparently Earth's president is available for a video conference whenever you guys are ready. She's been waiting by the phone for about 6 months now." The dean made a sound that was somewhere between a sob and a scream. "Your planet has been trying to contact us for 6 months and we've been ignoring them?" "Well," Jake said, "technically it's been about 50 years, but who's counting?" And that's when every single official in the room simultaneously realized that they were in the middle of the biggest diplomatic incident in galactic history, and it was all happening because a college student had asked a perfectly reasonable question about his homework. 3 weeks later, Jake Martinez had become the most famous student in the history of Galactic University. Not because he'd invented something revolutionary or solved some cosmic mystery, but because he'd accidentally exposed the fact that the galaxy's most prestigious academic institution had been teaching completely wrong information for the better part of 4 centuries. The transformation was remarkable. What had once been Extinct Civilizations 101 was now Contemporary Human Studies, and Professor Thornbottom had gone from being a smugly superior academic to being the guy who had to explain to his colleagues why he'd been confidently lecturing about the extinction of a species that was currently colonizing 3 solar systems and had just opened a Starbucks on Europa. "So," Jake said, settling into his seat in the now packed auditorium, "what are we learning about humans today, Professor?" Professor Thornbottom, who had aged approximately 20 years in 3 weeks, shuffled his notes with the resigned air of someone who had accepted that his life had become a cosmic joke. "Today, Mr. Martinez, we're discussing human expansion into the Outer Rim territories and their unusual approach to interstellar commerce." "Oh, you mean the whole selling obsolete technology to advance civilizations thing?" Jake asked cheerfully. "Yeah, we're really good at that." The class, which now included several Galactic Council observers, 3 investigative journalists, and a film crew making a documentary called How We Got Everything Wrong, A Galactic Perspective, leaned forward with rapt attention. "According to our latest intelligence reports," the professor continued, his voice carrying the tone of someone who had learned not to trust intelligence reports, "humans have established trade relationships with over 47 different species, most of whom are completely unaware that they're buying technology that's decades old." Ms. Glorbenia, who had become something of a human enthusiast since the revelation, raised a tentacle. "But why do they keep buying it if it's obsolete?" "Because," Jake explained, "we're really good at marketing. We put it in shiny boxes and call it artisanal retrotech. Apparently the Rigelians are paying premium prices for what we call Vintage 1000, 990S computing experience. They think it's a sophisticated aesthetic choice." The Galactic Council observer, a being that looked like a cross between a giraffe and a very stressed-out diplomat, made frantic notes. "And the humans find this amusing?" "Hilarious," Jake confirmed. "We've got entire departments dedicated to coming up with creative names for old technology. My personal favorite is when we sold the Andromedans a collection of floppy disks and called them primitive data storage artifacts with authentic tactile feedback mechanisms." Professor Thornbottom rubbed his temples with all four of his hands. "Mr. Martinez, are you telling me that humans have been systematically pranking the entire galaxy for 2 centuries? "Well," Jake said thoughtfully, "we prefer to think of it as conducting long-term sociological experiments in interspecies commerce. But yeah, it's basically been one giant prank." The documentary crew zoomed in on the professor's face, which was now cycling through every possible expression of academic horror. The poor Zephyrian had become the poster child for what happens when your entire field of expertise turns out to be based on fake news. "The truly remarkable thing," continued Jake, warming to his subject, "is that we've been trying to tell you guys the truth for decades. We sent formal diplomatic communications, we tried to establish trade relationships, we even sent a delegation to the Galactic Council wearing our best suits and carrying business cards. You know what they told us?" The council observer looked up from his notes with the expression of someone who was pretty sure he didn't want to hear the answer. "What did they tell you?" "That we look suspiciously similar to an extinct species and that we should try being more original with our evolutionary choices," Jake said with a grin. Direct quote. "We've got it recorded." The auditorium erupted in what could only be described as the academic equivalent of a riot. Students were talking over each other, the documentary crew was frantically trying to capture every angle, and the Galactic Council observer was having what appeared to be a very quiet, nervous breakdown. "So what happens now?" asked the crystalline echo, who had become surprisingly good at asking the questions everyone was thinking but afraid to voice. Jake shrugged. "Well, Earth's officially joining the Galactic Council next month. We're bringing snacks to the welcome party. Fair warning, though, we're probably going to revolutionize your entire understanding of what constitutes advanced civilization." "How so?" Professor Thornbottom asked, though he looked like he was afraid of the answer. "Because," Jake said, standing up and addressing the room with the casual confidence of someone who represented a species that had been underestimated for far too long, "humans don't just survive. We thrive. We adapt. We make friends with our enemies. We turn our mistakes into learning experiences. And we never, ever give up. Even when the entire galaxy thinks we're extinct." He paused, looking around the room at the collection of beings who had spent their entire lives believing they were the pinnacle of galactic evolution. "Oh, and one more thing," Jake added with a smile that was probably going to haunt Professor Thornbottom's dreams for years to come. "We've already figured out how to improve your faster-than-light travel by about 300%. We were just waiting for someone to ask nicely." The silence that followed was the sound of an entire galaxy realizing that everything they thought they knew about the universe was about to change. And it all started because one student asked what planet he was from. Professor Thornbottom looked at Jake, then at his lecture notes, then at the holographic display, still showing the extinct human, and finally at the camera crew that was documenting what would later be known as the day everything changed. "Class dismissed," he said weakly. Jake packed up his things and headed for the door, pausing only to call back over his shoulder, "Same time next week, Professor. I've got some really interesting stories about human coffee culture that I think the galaxy needs to hear." And as he walked out of the auditorium, Jake Martinez, the student who had accidentally triggered the biggest shift in galactic politics in recorded history, was already looking forward to his next assignment, explaining to the Galactic Council why humans put pineapple on pizza and why this was actually a sign of advanced civilization. The galaxy, as they say, would never be the same.